Hi again. Going to continue on with my build videos. I've been given an opportunity by a friend to actually build a vampire for him, so I thought I'd use it to do some more specific build videos. I'm also going to use the opportunity of having it here to do the full electronics build and setup that I haven't done as part of the rest of the series of videos. But really what I'm going to do is more, rather than go through the whole tedious build, because there is a lot of repetition with any of the Scarab builds, it's going to be more of a highlights and a tips and tricks sort of video. So I've already done some work here. I've already added most of the pins and Delrin blocks. I've left one out. I'll go through why in a minute, but I'll show you why. I've also added the 4 6mm mounting bolts that will be for the Voltaire power board. One thing I've done as the first tip and trick is I've actually taken a knife and pushing away from me, I've actually trimmed off the tips of the nylon standoffs. Usually you get about 3, 4, sometimes up to 5mm worth of nylon protruding proud of the metal standoffs when they're done. So the first thing I do when I've used those is trim that off with a knife, always pushing away from me and being very careful doing it, because one slip and you'll bleed. It just gives a bit of a smoother finish. You're going to have a lipo sitting across the bottom of the frame there, and it's just 4 less things that could potentially puncture the lipo. A lipo puncture in flight is not a fun thing. So I've already done that. So I've got my 4 studs in place. I've done my 6 boom mounts for my arms. I've got sitting there the mount for the front roll gimbal. These are all the Delrin blocks. Doing the alloy blocks is no different. I've used those in previous videos, so here's a chance to see the other hardware. The other thing I've done is I've put one of the 5mm screws in the back right corner of each block. That is to hold them in place just so they don't fall off while I'm working on it. But also we're going to put these in before the top plate goes on, because those holes are actually drilled out larger on the top plate specifically so we can actually have everything assembled and not flopping all over the place as we put the top plate on. It makes it a lot easier to work on. I have already assembled my 2 short booms with motors. Now when I did these, I did the S or Z bend in the wiring so that I've only got a little bit of wire hanging out the modem, out the booms. Alright, without actually cutting and having to resolder the wires. I've also done my 4 long booms. These you don't have to do the bend in. These are the 300mm booms, so the wire is the perfect length to come hanging out the end of the boom. One thing I've done here is I've put some white heat shrink on 2 of the carbon booms and some red heat shrink on the other 2, and that's to help orientation in flight when you're flying line of sight. I'm actually starting to rethink this. I'm finding the red is actually a bit hard to see in bright daylight, but the white is very obvious, so in future builds I'm probably not going to be, once I've run out of this red stuff, I'm probably not going to bother doing the red the heat shrink on the booms anymore. I'll just bother with the white. Okay, so I'm going to set those aside. We'll be using those in a minute and get on with my central pod. Now on this particular build, the owner has elected to go for the claw landing gear, which we'll be doing later. If I had the standard landing gear that comes with the Vampire kit, I would have already fitted it at this stage. When I mounted the 4 corner, if you like, blocks, I would have added on the 4 screws as I went, I would have added the landing gear as I went. So at this stage I would, if it was a normal build, already have the landing gear on at this stage. Okay? But with the claw gear, which I do prefer, I think they look a lot nicer. They give you also adjustable heights, which is really cool. But they also give you the advantage of not having to deal with the fact that you've got landing gear on the frame already while you're trying to do a lot of the rest of the build. It can sort of get a bit clumsy and in the way. It does make it a little bit trickier. This makes not having to use those legs does make it simpler, I suppose, to do the build. Okay, now, as I said, I've left off the rear Delrin block, and there's a reason for that. With the Vampire and a few other kits, you get these extended tail plates that hang off the back. And you actually have to fit that as part of mounting blocks. On a Stealth Recon, you actually have to secure it to the equivalent of those two screws, the innermost of the rear blocks, go into those holes. You have to actually do that, fit them to that. On the Vampire and the larger airframes, they do actually mount using 2 of the pin screws and a screw into the block. So that's why I haven't put the block on yet. Plus I'm going to show you some tricks I use when I'm actually putting the blocks onto the base plates. There's a little technique I've developed which just makes the process a lot easier. Because as you fit them, you need to align them. So what I've got now is the 2 blocks. I've got 4 of the 8mm screws, which on the Vampire are what is supplied for the base plate. I've got a pair of washers that are supplied with the tail. I've got an M3x8, and I've got my 4 pins, and lastly my M2x5 screw, which is going to go in the top corner to hold it all in place once I'm done. Alright, so grabbing my multi-rotor tool and one of the 8mm, the M2x8 screws, tiny dab of Loctite on the end of the screw. What I like to do is actually put my Loctite on any sort of scrappy bit of plastic I've got. Then I can just dip in. That's actually probably a bit too, can't see there, it's probably a bit too much of a blob of Loctite, but anyway, here we go. So what I like to do is 2 pins at first, and what I do is I leave them a little bit loose. Right, now for this back mount you need to do the inner 2 pair first. Sometimes I do the outer pairs, sometimes I do the inner pairs, you know, you can, let's face it, screwing on lots of these pins can get a little tedious, so, you know, not a bad idea to go for a little bit of variety while you're at it. So, I put 2 pins on. Now they've got a bit of wobble on them still, they're tight but they're not. While they've got a bit of wobble, I'm going to put one of the blocks over the top because it slides on very easily. And then with that block in place, I tighten those 2 screws up. So the bottom block will actually hold them straight. Okay, block slides, but very easily. Pins are now secure, not going anywhere, and it just makes that little process a bit easier. I'm going to place the top block over the top, and just for the sake of holding everything together, I'm going to take the little 5mm screw and put it into that inner corner to hold that block in place. Okay, now I'm going to take a pin, and I can actually slide it, if I might have to loosen this off, I can actually slide that into place. Okay, and the other one can slide in. Right. By doing it this way and actually sliding the pins into the block, you actually use the block to align the pins when you do the screws in the bottom. Now if this was a normal block, I'd do those 2 screws now, but because I've got to do the tail, I'm going to grab this M3 screw and screw the tail into place. That M3 screw goes into the block itself. Okay, it goes into one of these threaded studs that are in the block, and I'm using the center one. You've got 3 to choose from. could use either any of them, doesn't really matter. Okay, now you'll also notice that what's happened is that these 4 screw holes here are actually clearance holes. They actually go, so that's actually sitting over the top of those screws I've already done. Right, so that's why there's also these washers supplied for the other pair of screws. So I actually use the washer on these, on the screws that go at the outer pins, so that I'm actually also using that washer to grab the pin. Right. Okay, cool, that's one. Now, if you find when you do this that the screw won't quite, sometimes you can actually get it so that the screws do bind up like that one did. Nice. This one didn't quite tighten up because the pin's spinning inside the Delrin block. And that's fine, because what I'll do is I'll just lift the block back up a bit, just enough that I can sneak in with a small pair of pliers and hold the pin while I tighten the screw. Now I've still got that block in place on the pins, holding the pin in place. There it is, nicely snuggled up. Okay, and pop my little 5mm back into place, just to hold that block in position. Okay, done. Now, one thing I haven't done yet, you might want to do before you get this far, is this last very tip screw there. Take the opportunity now to drill that out to a 3mm hole. You're going to end up putting an M3 bolt through that hole there, and the same on the other, on the top plate, top one of these. So that very tip end screw there, hole, drill that out to M3. It's easier to do it now than later, but for the sake of brevity, I'm going to move on. Okay, next thing I'm going to fit is my Voltaire power board. Now, you just want to massage the wires out a bit. Make sure you've got the actual input lead, the power in lead, at the back. And we use 4 of our short nylon screws to hold that in place on those standoffs. It is vital that you use nylon standoffs for this board. If you screw it direct to the carbon, carbon is conductive, you will have a short circuit and blow up your battery. Not a good move. Might not blow up your battery, but you're certainly going to cause some damage, some sparks, a bit of smoke, who knows. So anyway, make sure you use the nylon standoffs. Okay. And now I'm in a position where I can start doing things like fitting my ESCs and my booms. So it's up to you which order you do this in, but I'm going to take my booms, firstly my 2 short ones. And at this point in time, it's not a bad idea to find yourself one of these boxes to sit underneath the frame, because it just elevates it enough to get the motors on the, allow for the motors on the arms. So we've got one motor through that side, and again I've covered how I like to line these up in other videos, but I like to have it so just the tiniest bit of boom is coming past the mounting block. Then my M5 goes back on. Okay. And that's boom number 1 in place. I'm going to go ahead now and fit up the rest of the booms and come back.